Hello and welcome back to Parley. This prompt was written by PistilWhip. Hope you'll enjoy listening. It's more communication. Communication 2, Electric Boogaloo. I'm going to be talking about what I'm going to call mutual comprehension. November Parley, following up on last month's discussion of meaningful communication. If memory serves, Captain has previously remarked on empty pleasantries, such as responding to "how are you" with "fine, how are you," without thinking. In a similar vein, Gandalf challenges Bilbo's greeting of good morning in an early scene of The Hobbit. The movie phrasing is somewhat different from the novels, but they're effectively expressing the same message. I'm going to read it. The text is provided below. "Good morning," said Bilbo, and he meant it. The sun was shining, and the grass was very green. But Gandalf looked at him from under long, bushy eyebrows that stuck out further than the brim of his shady hat. "What do you mean?" he said. "Do you wish me a good morning? Or mean that this is a good morning whether I want it or not? Or that you feel good this morning? Or that this is a morning to be good on?" And so my question, PistilWhip continues, is do exchanges of pleasantries constitute communication? Things like saying hello to passerby or thanking a cashier? Is there a threshold for duration or content before interactions can be considered communication? To go back to Bilbo's good morning example, is it enough for Bilbo to have decided on a particular meaning behind his words, or must Gandalf understand the same meaning before it is considered communication? Yes, if you've been watching a lot of Parley recently, you'll note that this is very similar to a lot of Parley that have been asked both by PistilWhip lately and by a few other people, and I don't think that's a bad thing, by the way. This is different in a few ways. In particular, I think that you've provided a very useful example. So because this is kind of similar and more usefully examplable than similar Parley recently, I'm going to push myself a little bit in this one. We're going to make some perhaps ambitious goals. Two of them connected. So the first one is to provide a real substantial answer to your question. What is the threshold for meaningful communication? And then the second one, which I think is going to be harder, is maybe what about a practical definition? Because, of course, if mutual understanding, mutual comprehension, I'm going to call it, is what's necessary for communication to feel legitimate, nearly zero of the communication that we'd refer to colloquially as communication counts. You know what I mean? Like, that hardly ever happens, to put it a different way. I'm not saying that that's irrelevant. I think it's very relevant. But it's certainly useful to think about what we might consider to constitute relative communication. Does that make sense? So let's define some terms first, because we're going to need them going into this one. There are kind of three, I think right now, things that I would like a term for. I really like your example as a way to break it down. So let's set that up and then use terms to clarify each of those kind of three states of communicating. So Bilbo says good morning to Gandalf. Now that could mean a variety of things, and it could also kind of mean nothing or like mean the social script pleasantry doesn't really mean anything meaning. I feel like that is a meaning, but it could mean a default meaning. How about that? There really doesn't need to be, there's really nothing to understand, you could say. Although, well, we'll get back to that. And then Gandalf on his end just kind of interprets a meaning or not. So there's sort of three things happening. People speak words to each other or otherwise like to colloquially communicate. Let's just call that talking for this Parley. So this would be when you do the social scripted one. I say good morning and you say good morning back, but neither of us were really intending any particular meaning. We just did it basically automatically. We did communicate the way we often use the word communicate, but there wasn't really any information communicated, except we're both kind of checking off the box on the social contract. Not necessarily a bad thing, but definitely not the same as the following two variants. The first one is that I say good morning to you, and I have a meaning other than the sort of default non-meaning of the social contract in mind. So I have some intent coming forward. You, when you respond, how are you, fine, how are you? If you respond to my good morning, you may also be the one with the intent. So one or the other person has some intent for the greeting or the pleasantry, but the other person doesn't pick up on it. It's important to note you can't know whether this has happened. So, for example, if I'm to be prickly for a moment, when PistilWhip said early in the parlay, I've previously remarked on empty pleasantries like on the stream, such as responding to "How are you?" with "Fine, how are you?" Like, obviously, there are times in my life that I've done this automatically, but you don't know. Like, you aren't the one who decides, of course, whether I was doing that automatically or not. On the stream, I can tell you I really don't. I'm anxious enough, I guess, just kind of naturally with no real way to prevent it, no matter how comfortable I am on the stream, which is pretty comfortable usually. And I also don't really by default respond to everything on the stream. Talking to me in person in passing, especially like maybe at the grocery store checking out or something, yeah, I occasionally reflexively respond with the thing. And again, there's no bad thing there. But just to say, I think it's critical to emphasize that this kind of middle one, where one of the people intends something, but there isn't mutual understanding or comprehension, you can't know whether that is happening, as far as I'm concerned. I think there is something of mental significance occurring there, but it's not knowable to either party. And I think that's one of the kind of wrenches in here. You can usually tell if both people have kind of autoed the thing, but without both people kind of picking up on each other's meaning, there might not be much difference between the really no communication and the mutual comprehension communication. And so let's just call the thing in the middle communicating, for lack of a better term, the way I will colloquially use it, because even though it's often more content than people communicating in passing, I think you would find that a lot of the time, one of the two parties in the conversation has an intent, and it just isn't picked up by the person on the other end. Or they both do, and they kind of go past each other. I think that's maybe the most common, maybe even more common than this sort of autopilot social script response. So we have nobody really intends any meaning, which we're just calling talking. People maybe intend meaning, one or the other or both people, but it doesn't kind of meet up. They're not mutually understanding. We'll call that communicating. And then mutual comprehension, the thing I titled the parlay. This is going to be when the people have kind of coupled their understandings and are now moving forward with the same particular intention for the words in mind. Mutual comprehension, I'll call it. Again, I think it's useful to emphasize just how rarely this likely happens in practice and how often you get close, but it just doesn't link up. I feel like that's quite critical. So to go back to the original content of this question, you said, is there a threshold of kind of for duration or content before interactions can be considered communication or mutual comprehension? And my answer is, I don't think maybe content is a prerequisite. There has to be something to understand, I guess. But I feel like the difference between people exchange pleasantries with no real substance and they both understand that they're exchanging pleasantries with no real substance, that's weirdly hard to say. That's kind of the same as if they intend something else and they both understand that it's something else. So I kind of feel like the content doesn't really matter, and there's not really any such thing as there being no content. Again, I would grade this sort of social script response as being content of a sort. So a lot of entanglement. But to back up for a moment, we have kind of three possible states. People respond basically on autopilot. There's really no thinking done about whether understanding is being achieved or what meaning is intended. They mean a default meaning. Maybe that's a little distinct, and we could just call it talking or exchanging pleasantries or whatever. The names don't really matter. But my point is that that's actually pretty similar to these other two. There's what you might call communicating. People have intentions. They're attempting to communicate. They have something beyond the default meaning of the words that they want to convey to the other party, but one or both of them, they don't link up, even if they have a meaning in mind. And then we have mutual comprehension. People have specific meanings in mind other than the default meaning, I guess, even though it's sort of the same if they both understand that. But anyway, other than the default meaning, and they mutually understand that they both mean a specific thing and are moving forward with that understanding. I think another way to put that is that something gets done. You actually accomplish some understanding and can move forward. That's really where I would draw the threshold. I think if something is going to be a sort of elevated communication, if we're going to put some kind of value judgment on this is more communication than just speaking and passing, I think that one of the prerequisites is that you can advance in the subject. And you can't really do that in a meaningful, useful way unless people have mutually understood or at least assumed something that is compatible with the other person's thing. It doesn't have to be the exact same understanding. Indeed, it will hardly ever be the exact same understanding. For example, let's say that I want to make a business deal with you. We're friends. Well, me and a friend of mine are going to make have a conversation and hang out, and I want to rope my friend into a highly advantageous business opportunity, because who wouldn't want to include their friend in this glorious adventure I'm going on in the capitalism? Anyway, and so I begin the conversation, and I say, "Hey, how's it been lately? How's work been?" Kind of knowing that my friend hasn't been enjoying their work situation, and they know that I know that. And so they say, it's been how it's been. We've kind of set a deadline for the end of the year and then I'm out of there. And we both know that we know this. And so where am I going with this? Am I just trying to encourage him or be there for him a little bit? He feels like this is kind of an expected thing. He knows I understand all of that. He knows that I know that I was going to get a response like that. Maybe why am I asking this? But I ask about this from time to time, and so, mutual understanding is there. This is, in my opinion, mutual comprehension. I'm not just asking to ask. I know this thing is going on, and he knows I know this thing is going on, and everything kind of links up for now. Though, again, he might suspect, why are you asking this? I know you know. And when we talked about hanging out, we also talked about this 2 days ago. So while it's nice that you're concerned, I wonder if there's something else going on. And indeed there is. And then I say, well, you got any plans for next year though? And he goes, oh, he must have had something in mind. And he's asking if I'm free, kind of. Again, I would argue this is sufficient for mutual comprehension. So we're moving along. It's going all right. And he says, well, I don't know. I think I'm probably not going to work for a little while. And I'll just see what's out there. I'll see what I want to do. I've been wanting to get into making video games for a little bit. And I say, yeah, I know. And smile a little bit. And he goes, okay, I mean, it would be fun to try making something together, but... And you can see here, mutual comprehension is definitely being achieved. He knew, it became obvious enough what I intended by this line of reasoning that I didn't even need to say it. He just felt like, okay, no. I know where this is going. Listen, I gotta have some time where I'm just not working. That was a soul-crushing work experience, and I have plenty of money now. So, just give me a sec here. I know you want to do the thing, and I kind of want to do the thing. But, just give me a sec. Give me some breathing room. And I knew he was going to say that too. And so I say, well, I'm not really suggesting that we work on something together. I'm actually suggesting that we both try to be ready for a game jam later this year, and we both enter and see how we do. A bit of a contest. I have my job, so I can kind of just do it during work hours, but you have more experience doing this than me, at least programming. I probably have a lot more experience as a game designer actually than this friend, but he knows a lot more programming. He could make a game faster, but I would suspect I would make a better game if my handicap of not knowing how to make a game at all isn't enough to make me unable to even produce a product. And so let's see what happens, right? And I just tell him all of that, and he thinks, yeah, that should be fun. Sure, let's do this. I think that in this example, there is kind of an ability to move forward. You can decide on something because there's not a need to spend the conversation just clarifying where you're going with things or getting the person on your side. I personally think that if you have real mutual understanding and you kind of know almost ahead of time where the conversation with the person is going to go, another key aspect is that it kind of avoids that thing where things have impact they wouldn't have had otherwise, is I guess where I'm going with this. You may have had times in your life, whoever you are listening. PistilWhip, I suspect you've experienced this. I think most of us have. If you're at all, not very young, it's hard not to have experienced this. But there's a kind of break point in your life at some point where you wanted to really impress something upon someone. You wanted them to really understand a thing that you'd understood. or felt like you understood, and you wanted them to feel the impact of that thing. To you, it was a big thing, and you wanted that impact to be felt. You wanted to feel as big to you, to them, as it feels to you. Feel as big to them as it feels to you. And they didn't. They, you kind of said it, and they sort of understood that you were saying something of gravitas, and so they didn't treat it lightly, but nothing happened. It just sort of vanished, which, is fine, kind of expected. I would like to suggest that one of the reasons that happens is because they are not fully synced up with that mindset of yours. One of the things that's magical about mutual comprehension is that once you have that, you can sort of keep going through a mindset, possibly further than the person you linked up with originally had, because they can kind of follow the logic quite a bit. I'm a big proponent of the idea that it's useful to think of reasoning or conclusions that are very solid as being not just one of many conclusions. If it is such a good idea, it's not like you just happened to think this of many things. Many smart people would come to the same conclusion. It logically makes sense, if it logically makes sense. And therefore people will arrive at the same conclusion if they sort of followed the steps, if that makes sense. So while it's not obviously guaranteed or a sure thing, whether or not people are going to, pick up on your meaning or whatever, it's still the case that if you are able to get somebody on the same page, you can kind of go somewhere in a way you kind of can't, or again, won't, if you're not on the same page. It might seem like, no, you can still accomplish things and get a conversation done, if you don't have mutual understanding. But I guess what I mean is that nothing is going to happen in any way other than it was just going to happen anyway, most of the time. Like, for example, you might be doing something at work. This is probably the most common time people don't have mutual understanding, but it appears that they're accomplishing something. But I think they're usually, it's not that they're not, it's just, it's quite played out. This was just going to happen anyway, and we're basically just checking or like doing the thing that you do at the work. And so there's not really a need to establish common ground. Nothing valuable gets done. How about that? That isn't trivial. You accomplish something, some basic work, but nothing that is particularly impressive. A very basic system suffices to accomplish those things. But if you want real, innovation done, or you want to go somewhere with an idea, I do think it's necessary to get on the same page if it's going to happen in at all a short amount of time. I'm always kind of scarred by this idea that in like game development, for example, people probably spend so much more time than is necessary not trying to get on the same page, but the thing that actually does need to happen is they need to get on the same page, but they do it using a systematic method instead of a personal method, like because they're part of a company. And so what would you do otherwise, right? Rather than dealing with every single person individually, you can make a bigger thing if you have a system that will eventually get people to understanding. But my word, it's so much faster if you just don't do that and try to get each individual person on the same page. I think in big organizations, people have the idea that that's not possible. But I have occasionally seen interviews from people who directed a game design, for example, for a pretty large team, and it seems to me like they took that approach instead, and it seems weird to other people, but it went very well, and the game is regarded very highly. A couple examples of games that sound like they were developed this way to me are God of War and some of the Smash titles. But that's just my outside observing perspective. The way that they describe their relationship with the directors for those games, Cory Balrog, right, for God of War? I'm not super good with names like this, and Sakurai for Smash. The way that the people working with those directors and the directors describe their process sounds to me like they understood just how much faster it would be if they tried to get on the same page manually with each individual, rather than trying to use a really inefficient system that would just like eventually get you there. Maybe. Not even really. You just gain so much time otherwise. Or, another thing I've experienced personally is working with someone creatively that isn't, they're being a follower. They are an independent creative with great ideas of their own. But when they're associated with a group, they just kind of play a role instead, which completely robs them of all value. Like suddenly they're basically just an image generator and they're not using the glorious creativity that they had. They just don't kind of do that in that space. And maybe that's because other people working on the project don't encourage it. But I certainly, like, I think it's basically pointless for me to work with anybody who isn't going to do their own thing, bring their own thing to the project. If there's something that you can do without understanding anything particularly from me, I'm pretty sure I can do that. I don't think I need help doing any of those things. It might make it faster, I guess. Maybe. I mean, you might be way better at using graphic design software than me, for example. But I know what I mean so much better than you do, that if you're not going to try to get on the same page as me and figure out something for yourself as well, bring your own vision to it, I could probably compensate for the fact that I don't have the skill with the fact that I do know what I'm trying to make. So again, kind of that race from my friend and I example before. He knows how to program a video game way more than I do, or programming that would be useful when making a video game, whatever way you were going to do that, way more than I do. But I know way more about game design than he does. And so I will have a target, but not know how to get there, whereas he'll know how to get there, but not have a target. And getting a target is much more variable. I mean, he'll make a game much more reliably than me, but my game will much more reliably be like worth playing, I guess, in that example. I actually don't think that. He will probably make a really cool game. I'm just saying in this example, you can see the merits, the trade-offs for each option. So I feel like that's a decent enough explanation for the concept of mutual comprehension. To me, it's communication that achieves something like that goes beyond just people intending things and causes people to really link up and synergize more than, ooh, that was a very business. I mean, synergy is a whole thing, but it felt businessy in this context. Ooh. Anyway, but you know what I mean. People sort of bring their own strengths to the table and are synergizing rather than just being two people that are functioning as they normally would. People are very inefficient in groups, in my opinion, unless they have kind of linked up like this, making it sound kind of romantic. And it is. I mean, you need to be willing to understand the other person's point of view. And I think that's why you'll find that people that are just not very nice, not very good people at the moment, people aren't inherently good or bad, but currently not very nice people, will fail to accomplish much of import. Not because it's magically impossible for them to be skilled if they're bad people, but because it's so ludicrously efficient to reach common understanding, but that requires a certain kindness or willingness to drop your mental barriers that you will find those people generally will not be able to perform. I've occasionally heard people get a lot of good creative work done, in particular, with someone who sounded like an asshole. And usually it sounded to me like it was because that person just did a very strong thing in the creative process that the other people happened to need. Like, for example, I heard in Disco Elysium's writing that one of the creative directors who politely, it sounds like a pretty jerk thing to do, would see what the people had written for the past week, read it, and then no edits, just say, this is garbage, you need to do better. Which, like, that's obviously stupid and inconsiderate. It's not effective, it's inefficient. But for the right person, you can see how that might happen to actually be effective by accident. I mean, basically by accident. And maybe it's just that this person has worked with enough people for whom it happened to work well, that they have the appearance of being an effective, editor or whatever position, but they're not. They would fail to work well with anybody who just happened to do that one thing well, I suspect. I'm basically just spending half the parlay disproving the idea that you can get much of anything of significance done without reaching mutual understanding, but I'm not sure that actually is important to do. But anyway, that's what I've done. There you go. So pretty thoroughly, I hope, I've established what I would consider to be the parameters for meaningful communication, weighty communication. You said meaningful communication. I'm calling it mutual comprehension or understanding. That, basically. I think it's defined by a massive increase in speed of the two people to the point that it will feel like progress is being made, real intellectual progress, possibly philosophical or ontological existential progress, where you would never have gotten there before. It's so much faster that I think a lot of the time you'll find that people who are willing to communicate this way will learn more in just a few conversations than many pairs of people will ever learn in their entire lifetimes. People could be married for their whole life, and they will be surpassed by a few people truly understanding each other for a few conversations. It's just that pointless to communicate otherwise. That's what I think, anyway. That's a stronger opinion than I thought I had, but I believe that. I do think that. So I want to spend a little time now trying to provide what I thought might be a more difficult answer, but we've laid a lot of groundwork, and that is for what might be a useful practical definition for communication, or relative communication. Because you know the thing I've spent the parlay describing is, well, I hope you're convinced, is really valuable, and you know it's not going to happen hardly ever, what about making some kind of distinction about, not all other communication is completely equal? Maybe there's some communication that's relatively more effective. I think this changes the script a lot. A lot. The same things are not valuable. If the premise is that you will not reach a further understanding together, I think that what makes communication valuable in absence of that becomes quite selfish. You can learn a lot of things from other people who won't effectively reach mutual comprehension, but I'm not sure that it's very likely that the other person will gain anything. I just don't think you'll get anywhere with anything in life without reaching some mutual comprehension. And so you may still be able to gain things from conversations that lack this. But the other person, I mean, unless they're willing to put the mileage in, probably won't. A couple examples of things that come to mind would be you can still kind of detect when people have opened up. I think that because people are used to a sort of social script, one thing, for example, that you'll find is that if you are open and receptive to hearing what they have to say and really listen, my experience has been that people will overshare surprisingly readily. You'll learn things about people, surprisingly personal, kind of out of nowhere, without them really having intended to talk about that, just because they're not really ready for the social script to go over there. Just very calmly saying, tell me more about that. Like, what's going on there? Usually people would have just calmly said some pleasantries like, that's interesting, or what a crazy thing to have happen. But if suddenly you invite further discussion, there's almost a very, very mild hypnosis-like effect in my experience, where people will just say the thing. I mean, it's nothing of consequence a lot of the time, just, somewhat personal. I'm not sure this is good. Maybe that's uncomfortable to suggest. I don't want to make people out to be total robots or anything. I'm just saying in that mode of communication, I find that people can be spoken to in a way where they will surprisingly intensively communicate, if you take it as a premise that you're not going to get anywhere in this discussion from like a philosophical perspective. And I've learned a lot of things about other people's perspectives, even people I've only spoken to for one or two conversations, that are useful perspectives sometimes. How do people in this living situation live? What do you think of this neighborhood, this car brand? I don't know. These things that, I don't have other people in my life to tell me about. I have, a very small, close circle of people. And so it's useful to just learn things about other people's perspectives. Beyond that, though, I don't know. So I do think that you can sort of take the same mode of communicating as social scripting, but go off the normal track a little bit. Remain on train tracks, but take a switch on the train tracks that isn't supposed to be switched that way. And you will chug along down the train tracks for a little bit. I'm not sure fully how valuable that is. But there's an ease to these conversations that I've always found kind of surprising, I guess. And personally, as someone who's quite anxious when I talk to people a lot of the time, I really dread doing basically anything when I go out. But you have to in life. And so I usually find it much more relaxing to take the premise that I might get to learn something about this other person. And they're not going to learn anything about me. They don't care about me. So there's no need to try to communicate those things. They're not going to pick them up anyway. And if they do, that will be so different from how most people communicate that I should just be able to notice. And then there you go. Is that cynicism robbing me of deep human connections now and again? Probably. Do I care? Not really. I personally think I'll take the security instead. And I get to open up a lot and express myself with all of you during Parley and streams and stuff. I don't really feel the need for that to be in passing. So I don't know, is that a complete enough example? It doesn't have very specific parameters, but to me that's sort of a format for communicating in those ways, or what those modes of communication look like to me most of the time. Hmm. Just to read what you asked again, but a threshold for duration or content before interactions can be considered communication. Well, while I don't think that there's a kind of set line, I feel like something worth considering is the idea that it usually takes a certain number of steps in a conversation to get anywhere. And so the first one or two, at least one, I think, is usually just wasted. It's quite rare to have a conversation where the very first step of the conversation is something that goes beyond what would normally be a part of that conversation. We're either on an unexpected social contracty track, or we've kind of broken past that and we're making real progress from sentence one. You know what I mean? Even in like fiction or like a book, it's quite rare for your very first sentence to accomplish a real movement through the story, like actual forward momentum in the story, rather than being like a really, really good framing device or kind of a palate cleanser or an appetizer. There are very good sentence ones in books. I did a whole class about this in college, about writing good first sentences for stories and poems, potentially, first lines. But indeed, I think even then, no matter how, even the very best ones I read, it's quite difficult for there to be momentum afterward. I think that the rhythm of starting with like a pleasantry sentence is quite thoroughly ingrained, especially in conversation, a framing sentence at least. When I write video scripts, I received an interesting piece of feedback one time in a comment on a video that the commenter felt like I made these really short videos one time, and the commenter felt like these are really getting right to the point. And it's interesting because the way I wrote those short videos they were commenting on was by writing a long video and then chopping it into 6 or so short videos. And so, like, I objectively wasn't getting to the point quicker in the topic overall. But I think that they felt like because the video was like a bite-sized piece, it was easier to perceive that we were going somewhere. And of course, the ones in the middle of the series, I guess, were, kind of right in the thick of it or whatever. And since I heard that piece of advice, I've had an experiment that's not just because of that one person. I would hate for them to feel put on the spot. That was useful. It was good. Since I received that piece of advice, this one thing led to another, and I've ended up very heavily interrogating my intros to videos. I think that intros are useful. I think they are useful. I think that making them a mini video, putting the point at the beginning, giving a little preview of what's coming, is a satisfying way to watch videos. It helps people frame their mindset for what might be a pretty dense video with a lot of topics in it. It gives them a place to go, or kind of an outline a little bit, and I try to do this in Parley, though a little less formally. And then breaking the subject down into further topics, talking about what you kind of previewed in sections, if it's going to be really long after that, is effective, I think. And I often talk about somewhat abstract or contrived topics, so I think it's a useful thing to do. But when I write videos like that, I always try deleting the entire intro. I highlight the entire intro and just hit cut, and then look at it, read it a little bit, and then I usually just hit paste again and put it back. But some of the time, I remove it or write like an incredibly short intro because it just wasn't doing anything the way the video flowed, or the kind of A to B to C relationship of the topics in the video is linear enough that it's just not really necessary. Or the video isn't a series of connected topics, it's like a list style video, so there's not as much of a need for an intro. And indeed, in most of those, I think I've done a good job. Like, there basically is no intro. If you watch the build system of the year, my favorites, some of the best build systems, whatever I call them, for each year. I only have one of them right now, but I'll be making one this month. Those have basically no intro, even though I didn't really do anything to get rid of it. There's just nothing to intro. I mean, you know what this is about. There's a little bit of a, like less than a minute of this is what I mean by a build system or whatever, and then I just do them. But I think that that's useful to think about. This original subject was about how even if you're going to converse to make progress, it's quite rare for that to be right away. And so there's a kind of minimum amount of time. So when you say duration or content, like more than one volley in the tennis match, if you want to think of it that way. I do think the very short minimum duration is kind of required unless the people know each other really well. And even then, often if you jump into something that doesn't provide the mental framing that might be useful, I almost feel like you require some kind of mental warm up period, like an engine warming up a little bit, where when you start a conversation, let's say that I say, I wanna try comparing these two lattes. This one has really light roasted coffee and this one has really dark roasted coffee. You want to do that now? My partner, even though we live together, talk a ton every day, make coffee together almost every day, and have talked about this subject, it's less likely that we're just going to jump right into that if I start it like that. She might say, yeah, do you want to right now or something? And that she's saying yes, sort of, which is possible because we're so close. But even then, it's like, what do you mean? Like, right this second, Whereas if I were to say, hey, you want to have some coffee? And she said, sure. Are you going to have some too? And I said, yeah, I was thinking we do that latte test thing. Now, even though it seems like I attacked the conversation point less quickly, there's a strange phenomenon in communication where that often leads to a shorter, more effective conversation, even though there is a filler chunk. It's almost like the minimum length for a conversation to accomplish anything is 2 sentences with normal cadences, unless there's so much prior understanding. And again, it almost feels like comprehension increases from that first basically useless sentence, even though it seems redundant. Being concise to an extreme feels like it kind of messes something up a little bit. When I was in elementary school, I was often chided for being overly concise. They'd be positive because they have to do that for your parents and say, oh, he has very concise, snappy answers, but I wasn't showing my work. And of course, from their perspective, that's bad. It's, not clear that I understand, but I completely understand and I just couldn't be bothered. I was being lazy, but I did understand. And of course, from their perspective, it's like, well, you may very well not understand. Maybe you're just copying the answers, understandable frustration on their part, but it misplaced, but understandable. And so personally, I think that is like sort of a weird note, that a sort of pleasantry or like revving the engine acceleration sentence is something that is characteristic of almost all modes of people communicating, even if they are not accomplishing much. Like, even if you are doing very effective communication, the very first sentence may be shockingly normal and redundant and useless, and that isn't actually that useless. I feel like that does kind of accomplish something. There sort of primes our brains to switch gears a little bit. Like, there's a physical amount of time required to switch gears a little, and so having a sentence for that helps. Maybe, I don't know, a sort of mental split step. I sort of feel like that's biting off a little more than I can chew, but it's a useful idea in the context of this discussion, I hope. I hope you feel like that's a complete answer. Again, I tried to push for something a little involved. Maybe it became too contrived, but I hope it was fun to listen to my extreme opinion on this subject. Thanks for the question. It was a lot of fun. I hope you don't feel like it's bad that you're asking similar things. I'll do my best to do something different with them.